Welcome to another episode of Jamming with Jason. Hey, today we have a very fun episode where we're going to be talking about folders, scrunchers, and rollers. And we might even talk about sitters and standers too. And as we get going in here, you're going to understand what that means exactly because I'm going to describe those terms and have that as part of our discussion today. So, with that, let's get started. Okay, now one thing that makes, or one thing kind of in common with all humans, and really kind of in common with all mammals and probably all living things, is we have to use the toilet or we have to go to the bathroom, right? And so, we'll talk about it from a human perspective because that's the way I understand it. We could talk about dogs too because I understand that. But let's talk about it from a human perspective, okay? And the reason why we're talking about this is, many of us grew up, uh, we'll say sheltered. And I know I find myself in that situation, and I'll explain what I mean. So I grew up in Boise, Idaho. And so in Boise, there's not a lot of diversity. And in fact, we lived out in the country. And so most of the people that I grew up with, most of the people, that we went to church with, were all kind of in the same socioeconomic scale. We were all, pretty much of the same race, if you will, same standing. Like I said, a lot of things that we did were with people from church. So there we were even, very similar from a religious view and our understanding and education. And so anytime that and all of us kind of grow up in a similar way where we're fairly sheltered, okay, because we're taught what our parents teach us. We're taught what we learn in school. We're taught what we learn if we go to church or on teams and other things like that. And for many of us, we tend to gravitate or be around a lot of people who are like us. And people who are like us tend to believe a lot of the things that we believe as well. And so that's what I mean by sheltered. And so if you think about your life, in your situation, it may have been that way or it may not have been that way. Okay. I'm just talking from my experience. And so I grew up, until I was 18 and went off to college. I went off my first year, I went to Brigham Young University because they told you I grew up Mormon. So I went to Mormon University. And so again, I was surrounded by a lot of people who believed the same things I did, looked a lot like I did. But my mind started getting opened a little bit, right? Because I was learning some things that were not just religious. And then after a year, I ended up going and serving a Mormon mission in Germany. So I was one of those white shirt and tie boys that goes around and knocks on people's door. So you may have had some of them visit you. That was me when I was 19 to 21. I spent 2 years in Germany and in Austria, and that was the starting of really me starting to open my eyes in a way. I was still surrounded by, mainly people in my religion. Most of them were Americans. There were some Germans who were also missionaries that were there. We had, I remember at least one Italian companion that I had as well. But like I said, for the most part, the missionaries themselves, we were all again a little bit sheltered. We'd all pretty much come from the U.S., grew up in very similar circumstances. But I started to learn some differences from my German companions, right? Because they grew up different than I did, because Germany is a different country than the United States. So I started to learn, more about how other people live. and what it's like to be other places. And I started to meet people when I was in Germany that were from all over the world. A lot of people from the former Soviet Union. That was about at the time when things kind of got broken up, and there were a lot of people from the former Soviet Union who immigrated to Germany. And so I started, understanding and learning and becoming friends with people who grew up kind of in an Eastern European background, which again, completely different than my background growing up in America, and especially growing up in Boise, Idaho, in America. Okay. But I started meeting other people too from places like Africa and other places in Eastern Europe and France and other places in Europe as well. And so I started to have an inkling a little bit of how the world could be different than what I was taught. And so I went through, completed my mission, went back home, and decided to finish my university at Boise State University. So I stayed in Boise, got married, continued to be a part of the church, started raising my family, and going to school there. And so again, I had learned some things from being in Germany, but then I moved back to Boise again in a very sheltered space. Most of the people, were again similar to me. They looked like me, similar socioeconomic backgrounds, and it kind of continued on that way as I started off with a young family. But I've always been one who reads and who kind of questions certain things, but I was really kind of afraid as a young man to voice some of those opinions or to think about it. But as I, again, continued in my university, I got exposed to a lot of different beliefs, a lot of different things from all over the world, right? From a humanities perspective, understood more about some of the ancient civilizations and history and other things like that. And so it kind of continued on, as I was living there in Boise, raising my family, doing some travel for work, but mainly, in the U.S. or in Australia, which again are different, but kind of the same as well. And then I moved to Los Angeles, and Los Angeles is a lot different than Boise, Idaho. Let's say that, right? I mean, there are people from literally all over the world who live there, people from all kinds of backgrounds, all up and down the socioeconomic scale. And so as I got to Los Angeles and started meeting other people, my mind and my world really started to open up a lot more at that point, right? Because I was starting to meet people who had completely different backgrounds than myself. And I was an executive. I had, again, a small family, was working a lot, but I decided that I wanted to get my MBA. And so I went to a night program through the University of Southern California. Go Trojans, fight on, right? And while I was in that academic environment, it was one that was quite different from the ones that I had at Brigham Young University and from what I had at Boise State, right? Because when I looked around the room, there were a lot of people who looked different than me. There was a lot more of a discrepancy between even things like age. I was the old guy in the room and with a lot of 20 somethings who were getting their MBA. And so I started to become, more uh, associated with diversity, but that's not quite the right term, but with diverse backgrounds, right? And with people believing different things than I had had before. And so over the course of the 3 years, I started learning more and having my eyes opened more to the world and to what other people believe, and started to question some of my beliefs, even at that point. And again, when that starts to happen, sometimes we can think that's scary, but it's actually very freeing and very exciting, because I'm a curious person. So again, I got my MBA, and then I, continued to work. I was traveling again with work. And then I ended up leaving my corporate job to start my own company. And so one of the first things that I did was I started traveling around the world, training people all over the world, literally everywhere in the world except Antarctica and South America. So if it was an English speaking area or if they did training in English, I was there. I was all over Europe. I was all over Africa. I was all over the Middle East. I was all over Asia. I was all over the US and Canada. And so, during that time when I was on the road a lot, okay, I would be gone about 30 plus weeks a year, 30 to 40 weeks a year, and literally put a couple 100,000 miles of air travel on my body each year. Now, as I would do that, one of my favorite things to do when I would travel is see how the people actually live. Okay. Because a lot of places where you can go in the world, they want to put on a certain picture from a marketing perspective for tourism and other things like that. Often there's, one side of a place that most people see, and then there's the other place where the people actually live and work. And so I would always take my time off outside of the normal work hours to explore, to eat different kinds of food, to walk around the cities where I was at. But I didn't just walk in the tourist areas. I would walk in the back alleys because, what's interesting is you can walk in front of a house, and that's what the owner wants you to see. But often it's a very different picture when you walk down an alleyway, which is not on the street. And often the back of the house looks completely different than the front of the house. In fact, one of my neighbors here repainted their house, but they only painted two sides of the house. Very interesting, huh? Anyway, so as I was having this experience, again, I was meeting people from literally all over the world. I was going to where they live. I was going with the locals after work to restaurants to see. So often, sometimes even visit their families, go to their homes, and see how they lived. And so again, during that whole period of time, I really started opening my mind even more. I started questioning more of what I actually believed and why I might believe that. And I started to change some of those beliefs. And again, as I told you, sometimes people think change is scary and don't want to change. But I have found that having a different worldview and actually changing your mind, seeing the world differently, opens it up to make it a very freeing place to live and helps you to understand yourself better and to understand other people better. Because the reality is, right, is most of the time we don't realize that people think different than we do. We're appalled sometimes when people think different than we do, right? We don't understand why people choose to make different decisions than we do. And a lot of it is, again, not understanding or seeing some of the change or the differences that are out there because we're only seeing the world in the way we were taught to see the world. And so, what I'd like to invite you to do is start to, maybe look around and start to question some of the worldviews that you have. Maybe even question some of the things that you've been taught because maybe you believe them, and that's just fine. Maybe you continue to believe them after you've questioned them. And maybe you choose to set aside some of those beliefs that no longer serve you, because that's what I've been doing in my life. And it makes all the difference. Now, some of you may be sitting there thinking, oh, come on, Jason, right? That's a good story, but come on, people should believe the same thing I do. And everybody else is wrong, and I'm right. I'm wrong. You're wrong, I'm right, sort of a thing. And so what I wanted to do was talk to you today again about folders, scrunchers, and rollers. And again, for most of you, you're not going to have any idea what I'm talking about until I tell you. And then this will be emblazoned in your mind, and it will be a good way for you to understand the topic that we're discussing today. Okay. And so, how did this conversation come up? Well, let me tell you another little story. So I was out to dinner, at the time with my wife and some people from our family and friends. And for some reason, there were probably about 10 of us at the restaurant, and we just started talking about different things. And all of a sudden, I don't know why this came up, but the topic of how you wipe your butt when you go to the toilet came up. And again, kind of a different conversation, but hey, we go there, right? And so, what was interesting is, as I said, there were about 10 people sitting around the table. And, for most of you, you probably don't even question how you go to the bathroom or how you wipe your butt. It was probably the way that your parents had taught you, or it's a method that you have developed over time for what works for you. But what was interesting is as we started talking, somebody said, well, do you sit down to wipe your butt or do you stand up and then wipe your butt? And it's like, whoa, all right. Everybody's like, what are you talking about? You mean there's more than one way to do it? And in fact, what was interesting is as we went around the table and everybody shared, 8 out of 10 people stood up to wipe their butt. Now, to me, that didn't make a lot of sense because I'm a sitter, right? Because I sit there, all right, and think, well, if I just go to the bathroom and then I stand up, my butt cheeks kind of go together. And doesn't that actually make it harder to actually get out what you're trying to get out of there, right? Without having some Klingons hanging around. And so, like I said, what was interesting is of everybody who was there, 8 of them were standers and only 2 of us were sitters. So, again, that's the first part of the story. So let's, stop and maybe ask yourself that. Are you a stander or a sitter? And again, there's no right or wrong answer. You can either stand or you can sit or you can do some other method that maybe I'm not aware of. There's no right and there's no wrong. But the important thing is to understand that people do things differently than you do. And it's okay. It's okay for the way that you do it. It's okay for the way that they do it. So that's standers and sitters. So, what are folders, scrunchers, and rollers? Well, that is how you deal with your toilet paper. Okay. So, folders are the ones who, roll out a little bit, take it off, and then fold it before wiping. Then you wipe, you fold, you wipe, you fold, right, until it gets too little or whatever. And then you do it again, right? Fold it, wipe, fold, wipe, fold, right? Okay, that's what a folder is. Scrunchers are people who, again, take some toilet paper off of the roll and they just squish it up into a ball and then they wipe with the ball. Okay. And rollers are the people who take the toilet paper off, they roll it up around their hand, and then they use that to wipe. So similar technique to folding, but not quite folding. It's rolling, right? So there's folders, scrunchers, and rollers. And so again, at this point, you stop and ask the question. So are you a folder? Are you a scruncher? Or are you a roller? I don't know. I'm a folder. I'm a folder and a sitter. And there's nothing wrong with that. And I'm probably not going to change how I do it. And it's okay, right? You may be something different, and that's okay too. If it works for you, it works for you. But what's interesting is, again, did you realize that there are different ways to do something as simple as going to the toilet that we do every single day? Now, the other question about the toilet and about toilet paper is, does the roll go over the top or does the roll go underneath, right? So which way you put the toilet paper on your toilet paper holder. And again, some people have very strong opinions about this. It has to be over the top. Other people like it under the bottom. My preference is I like it over the top, but I haven't always done it over the top, right? I'm an over the top kind of guy. Okay, so why, even though I prefer over the top, there's been times in my life when I've gone underneath instead of over the top, right? Why? Because we had a cat. And one of the fun things that our cat used to like to do is go in the bathroom, put its paws up on the toilet paper, and unroll it. So if your toilet paper goes over the top, guess what? Your cat can unroll it. If it goes over the bottom, it sits there and spins and spins and spins and spins, and it doesn't unroll. So, again, are you an over the top kind of toilet paper person, or are you an under? There's no right, there's no wrong. It's just what your preference is. But again, the important thing is to understand that different people do it different ways, and that's okay. The way you do it is okay, the way they do it is okay. But hopefully, it helps you to start understanding maybe why people do things in a different way than you do, right? And their way is not wrong. We don't have to convince them that their way is wrong because, again, there's probably a good reason why they're doing it that way. Now, some of you that are listening might say, "Oh my goodness, I didn't even realize that I could fold the toilet paper. I think I'd like to try that." Well, if you want to try folding your toilet paper, have at it, right? You have my permission to try it and see if you like it, right? Because that's the thing about life is choice, and we all have an opportunity to choose. And every time we do something, every day is new. We get a chance to make a new choice. So if some days you feel like folding, if some days you feel like scrunching, if some days you feel like rolling, it's okay. And you can try all three if you want to and see which one you like. Okay. Now, another story to tell you about this, because again, we think that everybody just does things the same way that we do. Well, I can't remember. I don't know if this is still accurate because this was a few years ago, but there's about 330 million people in the United States. Okay. And pretty much all of us have indoor plumbing, which means we have a toilet with water. So we go in, we use the bathroom, flush it down the drain, right? But there's something that's interesting too about toilets is toilets are actually slightly different in different parts of the world. Now, how do I know that? Because I've been in different places in the world. And guess what? Actually, the way that toilets are constructed and the way they work is sometimes very different, right? It's not always the same as, again, if you're in the US, uh, not the same necessarily for what you're used to. In fact, in parts of the Middle East, they have what are called Western toilets and Eastern toilets. Western toilets, Eastern toilets. A Western toilet looks like one in Europe or the United States. It's a porcelain throne that you sit down on. An Eastern toilet is a hole in the ground where you just squat over the hole. So again, many of you that live in the West and are used to conventional Western toilets may not even realize that there is such a thing as an Eastern toilet. Now, I myself prefer the Western toilet, but a lot of times when I was traveling in the Middle East, there was both in the bathroom, right? Some of the stalls were Western toilets, some of the stalls were Eastern toilets. Now, if all the Western toilets were full, I had to figure out how to use the Eastern toilet. And I think I did okay, okay at it. It took a little practice, but I learned how to do it in a different way, right? Because again, a lot of the world does things in a different way. But again, another story. My mom actually worked for our church. She worked for the group that was called facilities management. And what they did is they were the group that was responsible to build the churches around the world. And so anytime and maintain them. So right, so they would go in, they would build a church and then maintain it. And I remember her telling me a story because the office that she worked in, I think, was pretty much responsible for North and South America, or a lot of that area. And so, they had a kind of a standard church building plan, the doors and everything that they would use. And so I remember her talking about them going into South America and building a church. Nice, new, beautiful church building. And then they started having trouble with the toilets, and they were clogging up all the time. And they couldn't figure out why the toilets kept clogging until they realized that in that part of the world, people didn't use toilet paper. They weren't used to using toilet paper, right? In fact, instead of using toilet paper, they would use little rocks. So people, as they would walk around, they would find a nice smooth rock and they would use that to wipe their bum and then drop it in the toilet, right? Because they were used to not having indoor plumbing and just dropping the rock in an outhouse, not a big deal. Dropping a rock in a toilet, in a Western style toilet, can cause problems, right? And so again, I didn't know that people did that differently until my mother told me the story. And maybe you didn't know that either, right? But again, it's just different. There's nothing wrong, there's nothing right about either way. There's just a difference in how we do it. And as I started to tell you, in America, there's about 330 million people. Okay, a lot of people in the United States, but there's still something like 600,000 outhouses, which means that 600,000, homes in the United States don't have an indoor toilet, even today. Did you realize that? Right? And again, when I first read that, I thought, no, that can't be right. And then I went back and looked at it and I thought about it and I thought, well, now hold it just a minute. Our family cabin in the mountains does not have an indoor toilet either. We still have an outhouse at our cabin, right? So again, not only have I had to get used to obviously being trained on a Western indoor plumbing toilet, but I was trained on how to use an outhouse. I've used an Eastern style toilet. And when I go camping, right, I've used more of the Eastern style, but I've dug my own hole, right? Sort of a thing. So again, I know it's kind of silly, and some of you are probably like, Jason, I can't believe we're talking about toilets for so long. But even something as simple as going to the toilet, you can see how there's different ways to do it. The way you've been taught may be right for you. It may not be right for you anymore now that you know that there's different ways to go, right? Some people like to use bidets, right? Some of you may not even know what a bidet is, okay? But some of my friends have bidets. They love them. I don't like them. I've tried them. I don't like them, right? It doesn't work for me, but if it works for them, knock themselves out, right? Because again, I'm not here to preach to you, to tell you what to do, to tell you what not to do. All I'm trying to help show you is to maybe open your eyes a little bit. Open your eyes a little bit, like I started learning as I started traveling the world, as I started meeting people from other places, and realize that, you know what, maybe what you believe is not the only thing that you could believe. And maybe you could change your beliefs if you want to. Like I said, if you're a folder and you want to become a scruncher, give it a try. If you like scrunching better than folding, by all means, be a scruncher, right? And the same is true for a lot of the things that we believe. Because as I've gotten older, I've come to find out that a lot of the things that I was taught, even in school, that were quote unquote the facts, that were history, are not actually true. They're not actually true. It's what somebody wants you to believe instead of what actually happened. And much of your life is that way too. A lot of times people will tell you things because they want you to believe something, but the truth is very, very different, right? Even things that we see with our physical eyes, we can be tricked. The whole idea of sleight of hand and illusion and magic does that. It tricks our eyes. It makes us believe that something happened that actually didn't really happen, right? And again, in that instance, when it's for entertainment, great, right? It's wonderful. I love a good magic show. But if somebody's trying to pull the wool over my eyes or tell me something that's not actually true, I don't appreciate that as much, right? But again, that becomes my responsibility to question it, to maybe look at things critically, to question some of the beliefs, to question what people are saying. And it's not in a way to be a cynic and to never believe anything, but in the way for you to really understand if that's really right for you. Because that's really what's important, right? Because again, in order for you to be authentic and to really know yourself and to really be your best self and show up in the best way that you can in this world, to those that you love and to everyone else in the world, to show up your best way, even to things like the animals and the trees and the other things that we're connected to in this world. We really have to know who we are and do things from an authentic standpoint and also from a place of impeccability and integrity. And by knowing yourself, by questioning some of your beliefs to say, well, is that really what I believe? That helps you to actually know yourself better. So, with that, I'm going to wrap up today. It's been enough of an episode talking about toilets and toilet paper and everything else. But, again, hopefully you can understand. And it's not that we're talking about, but it is. And, in what ways in your life can you maybe start looking at some of the things that you thought were maybe the only way of doing it or the only true thing that is out there, and maybe start seeing if that really is what you believe. And have compassion for yourself if you decide to change your mind. It's okay. We can change our mind. We can choose different all the time. But maybe it also helps you to start to understand and appreciate and love other people around you a little bit more too. There's the old Native American proverb that says something like, never judge a man until you have walked miles in his moccasins. And that's true. A lot of times we maybe can't understand why people believe something so different than we do, why people say things so different than we do, why people do things so different than we do. But it's because they have a different background. They have different belief systems. They've been taught different things. And sometimes too, it's just that we have different ways of getting to the same point. Watching a political kind of documentary too about early America, and maybe I'll share more about that later. But I remember there was a scene in there where it really kind of made it clear that, a lot of times in politics, we may argue. Most of the time, we want the same thing at the end of the day. We just have different belief structures or different ideas of how to get to that same place. And it's okay to disagree, right? I mean, especially America. This was a country that was based on disagreement. It's a place where freedoms are here, so we're allowed to disagree with each other, and it's okay, right? You have your opinion, I have my opinion, that's fine. right? If I choose to change my opinion in the future, that's fine. If you choose to change your opinion in the future, that's fine, right? Because again, there's no right, there's no wrong. There's just what serves you at the time. And sometimes if things are no longer serving you, it really is time to start questioning some of those beliefs and deciding if you want to believe, think, or say things different in the future. Because ultimately, those things lead to the world that we create around us. And so, if you're not happy with the world in which you're living, one of those things probably needs to change. And one way to do that is to know more about yourself and really start to understand, who you are and why you're doing the things that you are. So with that, we're going to wrap it up this time as the rollers would do with the toilet paper. And we're going to fold up this episode and we're going to scrunch it up in a ball and we're going to throw it in the toilet. And with that, we're going to sign off for this week and I will see you on the next episode. Go out, have a great week, and yeah, we'll see you next time.